Hello everyone, today I wanted to do a bit of a follow-up video in addition to the video I already did talking about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. If you missed that, I feel like you should watch that and then this to kind of get the complete picture of what I think about the game. I talked in that one, tried to stay away from a lot of specifics and spoiler areas, but talked more broadly about my feelings regarding the entire experience, and that I think gave a good picture of what I think of the game. And today I just kind of wanted to add a few things that while filming that very just kind of off the cuff talking about my experience with the game in that video, there were a few things that came into my mind that I wanted to mention but purposely did not go into because they would involve some spoilers. So this video is basically just kind of adding into that video the things that I wanted to say and talk about briefly and didn't for the specific reason I'm not spoiling anything. So getting into it, first I want to just talk a little bit about one of the things I'd mentioned in that video in regards to why I like some of the expansive additions to the storytelling of the game and how that relates to some retellings of some events throughout Rebirth and compared to the original. What I love that what they're doing with these games is not just making things larger to make them larger, but adding, I feel like, layers and depth to a lot of the already interesting and fascinating events that take place within the story of Final Fantasy VII. And part of that is the ability to have far more character sequences leading up to big events, so when you get to those big, elaborate, or emotional, impactful moments, you already have much more time spent with little connections. And one thing that voice acting adds, even though in general I tend to prefer the older style and kind of reading the dialogue, the one thing that I think is beneficial and makes the experience overall superior from the character interaction portion of the game is the ability while you're running around or running to rescue someone or just walking through the world, you can have those little moments of banter back and forth, and it really starts to build relationships, and you get greater detail within those reactions. And one of the greatest examples of that is with Coral Prison and the Dyne Barrett relationship, because this is one where they kind of changed up the way things play out. I feel like the most, as far as some of the more standout portions of the story, and a portion that I felt was very emotional, one of the most emotional aspects of playing the original game as a kid, and I've seen some kind of mixed reaction to how they handled it within Rebirth, and to me I feel like it was just handled in a different way given the different style and structure of storytelling, and talking about the build-up of many different character scenes, developing more of a backstory and more of a connection between the different characters in your party leading up to events, whereas I feel like the actual meeting of Dyne and Barrett in the original game, within that, the context of that meeting, so much of the story of their background had to be portrayed. And I see a lot of connection to that original portrayal versus this new one, saying how the original was better. And I think in that isolated context, that is true. It is more impactful. But I feel like in the broader scope, I kind of prefer Rebirth's version, because that moment, that interaction, doesn't have to have quite as much of the reveal portion of the backstory, as I feel like you got more and a stronger representation of Barrett's history leading up to that event. You had more moments, I think, leading, starting just as they enter the region, getting bits and pieces and getting the feeling or the heaviness, and then walking through town, and especially then the larger reveal when you are getting ready to go into the Gulser. And I just feel like there is a better job of getting that history across in the lead up, to where when you got to the actual event, you already had enough backstory that it didn't quite go into it as much within that context. So I felt like, I don't know, I think it was just a different way of approaching it, and a few details about North Corel and like the prison, and there was some things that were shifted around. I felt like it was just a slightly different way of experiencing that story. And the other thing that I feel rubbed some people the wrong way was the immediacy of then getting into a boss fight right as that portion of the story reaches this emotional high point. Just completely bowls you over with this sorrow and regret, and just it's so powerful and wonderful. And part of it is, I feel like the voice actor for Barrett in these games, he's incredible. And here, I feel like this was the moment more than any other time in this game or in Remake that he really shined and just brought so much emotion, and it was incredible. This, and then when they have to go through their trials later in the game, the final dungeon, the city of the Ancients, those moments I feel like really bring the emotional core of Barrett to life so strongly. And then so abruptly going into a boss fight without having the time to really process those emotions and contemplate the situation, really have the time to kind of heal and then move on, immediately getting right back into the action. I know some people pacing wise that threw them off, but for me, while I can understand that, I actually liked the discomfort and the intrusiveness of that event, because that reflected, I feel like, a more realistic depiction of how that would happen. Often in real life, you don't have the benefit of getting the time to process and mourn. Frequently, life just immediately comes right at you, and you have no control over it, and you have to push those powerful feelings aside to handle what's before you, and then process them as time moves on. And so I kind of liked it. Was very, uncomfortable, and you wanted that time to be there with Barrett in his moment and process things more fully. Like, I wanted that, but I'm kind of glad I didn't get what I want, because it made it, I feel like, more emotionally impactful and almost frustrating, because that's kind of how things happen. It really dug into the immediacy of their journey and how they just don't have the time to process loss and parting. You don't have that moment. You have to kind of keep going. Life is always in your face, and I feel like it added to that. So it's one of those moments that I feel like was just handled very differently, and I can kind of see where some people like the original better, and I like both for different reasons. It was a different telling. One that was different than that I felt just genuinely blew away the original, which is saying a lot, because it was one of my favorite areas and story points in the original, was getting into Cosmo Canyon. I felt that this was one of my favorite examples of deepening the lore of the background of a character and of the world, and integrating that into gameplay. The trial with Red 13, with Nanaki, and Barrett at his side, I loved that. It was a great balance of puzzles that were very simple but still fun to complete, and interesting, and they were paced well and were woven into the narrative in a way that slowly pieced together bits of story while you're journeying through and solving these puzzles. And I thought it was done really well, and I loved the expansion of the story of the Gi and Black Materia. And this was, to me, one of my favorite examples of just kind of deepening the storytelling through this more expanded version of the original game story. So I really love that. It's one of my favorite parts of the game, especially getting into the village of the Gi, crossing those waters, and having your moment in the live stream with Zack and his portion, which I'll talk more about Zack in a little bit here. Getting to that, and just the style of the architecture and just the general vibe of the lighting mixed with the music, it just felt so mystical and powerful, and it was fascinating getting, I feel like, a deeper context for their story and this eternal kind of purgatory that they're in, and their connection to the story of the Black Materia. And I just really loved that. It was one of the standout examples of what I feel like this game did best. Like, they kind of did that for just about every area of the game. Took something that was already amazing and made it better by just adding more layers and more vibrancy to the storytelling, intertwining it with the environments in this style. One of my other favorite regions is Gongaga, and I feel like that vibrant jungle was another great example of the environment tying directly into a location and into the storytelling and making it feel like one big interconnected world, and not having that separation between a point of interest, a town, a village, whatever, and the area in between. They weren't just these separate points on a map. They really felt like one continuous world, and that was one of the better transitions, I feel like, too, even from one area into the other, moving from the Saucer and the desert, into that region. There were so many great transitions and just brilliant. And that was one of the other interesting examples. I feel like every region did a great job of the different variations of chocobo travel. It was fun in general, but the fact that each region had a different ability that was used to explore the environment, and a fun little puzzle just to wrangle your chocobo was great in each area. And I'd love to hear, what were your overall favorite environments to explore within Final Fantasy VII Rebirth? I really thought while playing through for the first time and how much fun I was having as the game was getting rolling, that my favorite area would probably just be like the grasslands. I was so overwhelmed with how incredible it was just in those opening moments, but having played through, and at the time I'm recording this, I'm wrapping up my kind of New Game Plus, going back through. I should be playing other games, but I just immediately went into New Game Plus because I love this so much. And one of my favorite things is exploring these environments. I'd have to say that Gongaga, I just love the feel, and again, the style of the environment mixed with the music, and how that was kind of, especially in the areas where you have to go and leap from those pads, from the mushrooms with the chocobo. It was almost like this little puzzle within the environment, and it was fascinating. I love the feel of that. That was one of my favorites. That and Cosmo Canyon were probably my two favorite environments to just explore. Just overall, I think those were the two that I liked the best. I'd love to hear what some of your favorites are. For the fun factor, I really loved Costa del Sol and just the surrounding area, and I really enjoyed that. That was probably the most downright just enjoyable and fun. But yeah, those other two are definitely, I think, my overall favorites. They just were the ones that surprised me the most with how much I really enjoyed both just traveling on foot and exploring them, and again, the music fitting into the environment, just a lot of fun. But those two were the standouts for me for the chocobo travel, and how the solving kind of the puzzles of exploring those environments were intertwined with the chocobo ability. The last thing I want to talk about a little bit, but I kind of want to just cover it briefly because I feel like I have a lot of theories and connections that will be addressed in the third game, and I'd rather kind of wait to get deep into that until we can see where things are going, is the inclusion of Zack and the ending of the game. Going into this, it was interesting, and I felt like all the way up until the last chapter of the game, a bit underplayed, was the inclusion of Zack's side of the story within his plane of existence, and that dealing with the connections of different worlds and the life stream and fate and the interconnection, the realm between realms with the Black Materia. I felt like that was all very hinted at more until you got near the very end of the game, and it was interesting, but I wanted a little more time and exploration with that portion of the game. I felt like the points with Zack were very brief, and they got the message across, but I felt like I wanted a bit more time with him and a little bit more time exploring that element of this story, since the idea of fate and meaning of existence is so strong and was pushed so heavily with the Whispers in Remake, that I was enjoying that element and what it added to the complexity of the narrative, and including, Zack. It was very interesting, but I was a little almost disappointed in that element until we got near the end, where I feel like things connected so much more and you got such a clearer picture, especially with that Cloud and Aerith going on their ill-fated date, and just little points of decision that towards the end, alright, things are finally kind of clicking, and I absolutely loved the ending and how it was this interesting culmination of the differences and the additions to this adaptation of the Final Fantasy VII story, meeting with the canonical storytelling up to this point of the original, and kind of fusing those elements to create the ending of this chapter. And I felt like the story of Zack in this part, while I felt like in the beginning, okay, maybe this will be the bulk of his addition to this version of the story, I really got the feeling that it was more of the introduction in this chapter of his participation in the story. I really feel like we're going to get a lot more of him in the third game, and it's going to be much more meaningful than just in these moments, especially with him, the moment of him teaming up with Cloud to fight Sephiroth. And I felt like it tied so much. We got a clear picture of Cloud both in Remake and Rebirth, and what his connections are to Sephiroth, and the real confusion and disconnection within himself. And here it tied in, I feel like, more beautifully with how that's represented in reality as well. The disconnection and the confusion within him is mirrored, and especially how he can see Aerith and he can see the breach between planes of existence, and he has had more of a connection to these different versions of reality. And I feel like that's represented in a way that was fascinating and still very clear, especially as we have moments that are very much from Cloud's perception, and how that perception is altered by his shattered psyche, his mental state, and also Sephiroth's constant meddling with the fabric of reality pretty almost by the end. It's just fascinating to see those webs come together, and I love the way it was handled. And I felt like, again, with the inclusion of Zack and the way the ending came together, that a lot of it was both tied together in this, but also, again, I feel like was really reaching towards what the third part is going to be, and there's a lot more of build-up and hinting to what the giant conclusion is going to be, and I'm excited to see where they take that in the third part, and what they do with the elements that they set up within Rebirth. And one thing that I'm looking forward to, I feel like almost the most in whatever this third part is going to be called, is something else that's been built up largely and in both parts of the game so far, is getting into Wutai. I feel like they've added so much more to the connection and history of the war between Shinra and Wutai, and especially with the character of Yuffie, who was always one of my favorites in the original, and just my clear favorite character in this new adaptation. I just love what they did with her character, and I am ecstatic to see what they do with that storyline. And I feel like it'll play a much larger role, and it will be a massive explorable area. I feel like that is going to be a big portion, a big chunk of the third chapter. And ending here at this point was, I feel like, just the perfect spot. It had to end at this point, and I felt like it was an earned payoff. With the City of the Ancients was incredible. It was so brilliantly laid out with the puzzles. It was a lot of fun. It was a great build-up. This incredible finale with so many different portions of the multiple, boss fights towards the end. And I'm interested to see where they take Sephiroth in that final portion as well, since we got that, Bizarro Sephiroth, we got that form that's so iconic from the ending fights with the original game already in this portion. So where are they going to take it from there? So I was incredibly happy with the way the ending played out, and with the more controversial additions to the story that could have come across as convoluted, that I feel like were more successfully portrayed than I had anticipated, and turned out fantastic. And I feel like we're just more of a great build up to what's going to happen in this third part. So that's kind of what I wanted to add, that the things that came up in my mind, that cropped up in my thoughts as I was filming that first portion of the video, just kind of talking about this game. So a few things that are spoiler filled that I wanted to get across. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and again, what were some of your favorite areas to explore? What did you think of the expanded lore in this portion of this story, and how they handled the more complex issues with Zack and with these different realities, and how things are building up? I'd love to hear where you think they're going to take the third chapter, and what are you most excited to see? I'm curious to see how they implement travel with the high wind and the freedom that gives. So many cool things to look forward to. And who are your favorite characters from, now we have Remake and Rebirth, who are your favorite characters so far? And is that any different from who your favorites were in the original version of the game? Now for me, I feel like they have done the most with expanding Barrett and Yuffie. Everyone, I feel like, has had an expansion to their story, but those two, I feel, for me, I've connected with the most. So Tifa, Yuffie, and Barrett are my three favorites so far with Remake and Rebirth, with, for me, just Yuffie ending up on top because she's just so fun and adorable, and I don't know, I really am looking forward to what they're going to do with her in particular in part 3, because I feel like there is the potential to do some really powerful character stuff with her once we go to Wutai. And I feel like in this portion, Barrett probably overall had some of my favorite story moments, and I just love his personality. So anyway, just fantastic game. It's one of those games that completely blew my mind. It was an incredible experience. I'm in the middle of replaying it again, and I just can't get enough of it.